Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive? You guys sent in some really interesting stuff about the early days of COVID
Yeah,
here in the US.
this is going to be fascinating.
Yeah, it's we've got this huge report actually from the select subcommittee on the coronavirus crisis.
Oh, wow.
And then we've got this really great article from factcheck.org that kind of tackles some of the public health messaging and how that was dealt with in those first few months of the pandemic.
I'm very curious to see how those two things line up.
Yeah, me too. So I think it's going to be really interesting to kind of look at them side by side because we're really trying to unpack, I think, the economic and political fallout, right, from those first few months of the pandemic.
Yeah, the fallout was significant.
Yeah, it was huge and it's still being felt today. So I think it's really interesting to kind of go back and see, what was happening, what was going on.
And what we knew at the time versus what we know now, right?
Wow. Exactly, exactly. So I thought maybe we could start with this subcommittee report. Have you had a chance to look at this at all?
I have. It's quite something.
It's doozy.
Yeah.
It is a lot. And they don't really mince words either. Like right up the bat, they pretty much call the Trump administration's response a catastrophe.
Yeah, well, I mean, they make it very clear they think it was handled quite poorly.
Yeah. And they back it up with some really stark figures too, which I think is really important because yeah, sometimes you can have these reports and it's just a lot of, opinions and what people felt like was going on.
Right. It's got to have that data.
Yeah, you need the data, exactly. And so, like, one of the things that they highlight right off the bat is that by late October of 2020, over 227,000 Americans had died from COVID-19.
Wow, that's a staggering number.
Yeah, and to put that in perspective, they point out that that's more than all the U.S. casualties from World War I, the Korean War, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and the Iraq War combined.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Combined,
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, that really drives home the sheer scale of it.
it does. It really does. And it's just really hard to wrap your head around that number, I think.
It's hard to even fathom that many people.
Yeah, exactly. And the report actually argues that many of those lives could have been saved with a more effective response from the federal government. And that's
Mhm.
kind of where they start to really dig into, okay, so what was happening and how could things have been done differently?
Yeah, because that's the big question, isn't it? Could things have been different?
Right. And I think that's one of the reasons this report is so fascinating is they really do try to delve into that question of what went wrong, what
Mhm.
could have been done differently, and they actually draw a parallel to the Truman Committee, which I thought was really interesting. Are you familiar with that?
Vaguely. Refresh my memory.
Yeah, so the Truman Committee was formed during World War II, and it was basically tasked with investigating waste and corruption in the war effort. So they were, looking at government contracts and things like that, and it ended up saving taxpayers a lot of money and really kind of changing the way that the government did business.
Interesting. So they're making a comparison between wartime and the pandemic.
Exactly. And they're saying that just like with the Truman Committee, this time the focus is on the pandemic response.
Hmm.
And they're looking at waste, fraud, abuse, all of those things that could have potentially led to, not just a loss of life, but also, of course, a huge economic fallout. And speaking of which, they actually cite a $16 trillion loss in economic output as a result of the pandemic.
$16 trillion.
$16 trillion. That's trillion with a T.
Wow.
To put that in perspective, that's more than the entire annual economic output of China.
That's almost unfathomable. Like how do you even wrap your mind around a number that big?
I don't know. It's one of those things where it's just like, okay, this is a massive, massive amount of money.
Right.
And they tie that directly to the way the pandemic was handled. Yeah. Both in terms of public health and, of course, the economic fallout.
Yeah, because if you don't get a handle on the virus, the economy is going to suffer.
Exactly. And they point to things like, over 60 million unemployment claims filed during that time, which is a record high.
I remember those days. It was just line after line of people.
It was unbelievable.
It's heartbreaking.
Yeah, and they talk about, widespread poverty and food insecurity, families struggling to put food on the table, to keep a roof over their heads. In fact, they mentioned that 1 in 3 adults in the U.S. feared being evicted from their homes during that time.
Wow, 1 in 3. That's a huge chunk of the population.
It's a staggering statistic.
Yeah.
And it really just kind of drives home the level of fear and uncertainty that people were dealing with.
Yeah, you can't underestimate that fear factor, People didn't know what was going to happen, didn't know if they were going to be able to feed their families.
Yeah, it was a really, really scary time.
Hmm?
And it's like, on top of all that economic turmoil, the report really seems to take issue with the way that the Trump administration protected, or I guess didn't protect, vulnerable Americans.
Yeah, they really lay into that.
Yeah.
They point to the economic impact payments as a prime example.
Oh, you mean those stimulus checks?
Yeah, the stimulus checks. Apparently, millions of low-income Americans had to wait more than 6 months to receive theirs.
Oh, wow. I did not realize it was that long.
Yeah, because of bureaucratic delays and stuff.
Oh my gosh, people were just like struggling to buy groceries, pay rent.
Absolutely. Basic necessities.
Right.
People needed that money, and it was just tied up.
Oh, that's awful. It just seems like there were issues with pretty much every program. Like the report also mentions the Paycheck Protection Program, the PPP loans.
Right. Right. Which was supposed to help those small businesses keep their employees on payroll.
Right, exactly. It's like, don't worry, we're going to help you make payroll so you don't have to lay everybody off.
Right. Keep the lights on, keep people employed.
Exactly.
But the subcommittee found that, the way the program was structured, especially the Treasury Department's guidance, seemed to put minority-owned businesses at a real disadvantage.
So wait, so the businesses that were probably hit hardest by the pandemic were actually the least likely to get the help they needed.
It seems that way from the report.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's kind of the opposite of what you would want to happen.
Right. You would think they would need it the most. And the report kind of speculates that maybe it's because minority-owned businesses often lack those pre-existing relationships with banks
Oh, that makes sense.
that were essential for, navigating the PPP application process.
Okay, so you've got these issues with aid distribution, it sounds like. And then this is where I thought it got really interesting, is that the report talks about the Federal Reserve buying bonds from companies that were simultaneously laying off, like millions of workers.
Yeah. That was a very interesting tidbit.
It was very interesting, and I don't fully understand what that means.
Right. So basically, the Fed buying bonds, it's all about injecting money into the economy, trying to stabilize things.
Okay.
But the report suggests that in this case, it may have had this unintended consequence of benefiting the corporations that were actually, the ones doing all this massive laying off.
So it's like, on the one hand, you have this huge loss of jobs, right? And then on the other hand, the Fed is taking these actions that, I mean, at least on the surface, appeared to be helping the companies that are doing the laying off.
Yeah. And it's not to say that it was the wrong decision necessarily. It's just, it raises questions
Exactly.
about the intended and unintended consequences. And speaking of things with unintended consequences, let's turn to that factcheck.org article that you pulled up, because they really dig into this debate over, testing accuracy and how that impacted our understanding of the pandemic in those very early days. It was a very confusing time.
It was a very, very confusing time. I mean, every day there was a new headline.
Constantly, right?
Yeah.
Every day.
Every day a new number, a new expert opinion. You didn't know what to believe.
Yeah, and that's why I think this is so important to understand these nuances, right?
Okay.
Because, for instance, just increasing the number of COVID tests doesn't necessarily mean there are more cases.
Right.
Right. It's the positivity rate.
Okay.
The percentage of tests that are coming back positive that really give you a clearer picture
Of how widespread the virus actually is, yeah.
Exactly. Okay, that makes sense.
And on top of that, we had, hospitalization rates going through the roof at the time.
Right. Which, again, further indicates that, okay, it's not just a matter of more testing. The virus is actually really spreading quickly.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And, it's interesting because the factcheck.org article mentions something that Dr. Fauci said about, like, the U.S. only functionally shutting down by about 50% compared to parts of Europe that went into, like, near total lockdowns.
Right. I remember that. Like 95%,
Yeah.
some places even more.
Yeah, it's like, wow, that's a big difference.
Huge difference.
It really is. And it makes you wonder, like, how would things have been different if we had taken those more drastic measures early on,
Yeah. It's hard to say. It's a hypothetical, but it does make you wonder.
It does. It really does. And of course, you have to weigh that against the potential economic impact of those kinds of stricter lockdowns.
Absolutely. It's a complex issue.
It's very complex. And speaking of complex issues, the subcommittee report really dives into this whole idea of political interference, right?
Mm-hmm.
In the government's response to the pandemic, particularly with, like, public health messaging.
Right, because it was a whole other layer to it, wasn't it?
It was like, are we getting accurate information?
Right.
Like, who do we trust?
And they detail, these allegations of pressure from the White House to to downplay the severity of the virus.
Yeah, it's kind of scary to think about that.
It's very concerning. There were accounts of, efforts to discourage mask mandates, to push for schools to reopen, even when, you had public health experts saying, maybe we should wait.
Yeah. And then there was that whole thing about President Trump allegedly saying, slow the testing down.
Yeah, that was a bombshell when that came out.
It was huge, huge deal. And, if that's true, it just seems to contradict, everything we know about needing accurate information to actually fight a pandemic.
Well, and it also speaks to that trust issue we were talking about because, if people feel like information is being manipulated
Yeah.
or if they feel like leaders are downplaying risks, it really erodes public trust, and that makes it, so much harder to encourage people to follow public health guidelines.
Right. Because if you don't trust the messenger, you're not going to listen to the message.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point.
Yeah.
So, wow, we covered a lot here. We talked about the human cost, the economic toll, the government response or lack thereof, and, of course, all the politics that seems to be intertwined with all of this. It's a lot to take in. What do you think is like the most crucial takeaway from all of this?
I think for me it's this idea of transparency and accountability.
Okay.
Because this report exists because Congress demanded answers.
Right.
They held hearings, they fought for access to documents.
Right.
And without that level of scrutiny, without holding, those in power accountable for their actions, I really worry that we risk repeating the same mistakes.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really, really good point. And it's not just about looking back, right?
Right.
It's about learning from the past so we can hopefully create a better future.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And I think that's a good place to leave our listeners with this one thought.
Okay.
Could some of this suffering, both in terms of, the tragic loss of life and the economic hardship, could it have been avoided, right? With different policies, with less political interference, with, maybe a more focused effort on protecting the most vulnerable?
It's a question worth asking.
It is. It's a question I think we all need to sit with as we continue to, explore these sources and just grapple with the complexities of what happened.
Absolutely. And it just reminds us that staying informed and asking those tough questions and engaging in these conversations is more important than ever.
Couldn't agree more.
So until next time, keep diving deep and stay curious, everyone.